Tessa, why are you in favour of a windfall tax?
Well, in short, John, we are in the middle of a massive cost of living crisis in this country, where the CEOs of energy companies themselves predict that 40% of UK households will be pushed into fuel poverty by the end of the year as a result of soaring energy prices driven up by the price of gas. And at the same time, oil and gas companies that are extracting oil and gas from the North Sea are, as a result of those same escalating gas prices, making close to record profits. And just today, we heard that BP had posted near record profits from the last quarter of £5 billion and announced a scheme of share buybacks for their shareholders. And it is really obscene that the government is not taking this opportunity, especially given that we have an incredibly generous tax environment in the UK for oil and gas companies, to claw back some of that excess profit to help offset the real suffering that families all over the UK are experiencing and will continue to experience in the coming months because of their energy bills.
And Ross, from a public's point of view, that sounds quite a persuasive argument, doesn't it?
It does. So from everybody's perspective, this is such a difficult time for people right the way across our society. But I don't think there's any quick and easy fixes to this. But we have to recognise our industry is part of the solution to this, and it is making an active contribution to our energy system, both today, our net zero future, as well as that as we look forward. Our industry contributes a huge amount towards society. At the moment, it's paying about £20 million per day in taxes. And over the next 5 years, it's expected to contribute something in the region of £23 billion in taxes from the production of oil and gas in the UK. That's more than double the amount that the government forecast that our industry would contribute just 6 months ago. So the tax regime is working, and as companies are making more money and higher profits, they're paying higher taxes.
But given that these are extraordinary times, particularly in terms of cost of living crisis, would it not make sense that extraordinary profits for this period, some of that can be used to help people who are in need?
So what we are seeing is that the industry is paying higher tax amounts because of what's being seen in the macro environment and higher profits being made by companies. As I said, £20 million a day and double the amount of taxes in the coming years, including this year we'll pay more than double the amount that we paid last year. BP said today alone that we'll be paying £1 billion in taxes in 2022. The right thing for us to reflect upon is how the government use that money to the best of their ability in order to support households and bill payers across the country.
Tessa, how much would a windfall tax raise, do you think, and who would benefit specifically?
Well, I think it's first important to introduce a bit of context to some of Ross's assertions. The first thing is to say that companies in the UK, oil and gas companies, pay among the lowest tax rates of oil and gas companies anywhere in the world. So compared to Norway, for example, which is another North Sea oil and gas producing country, the Norwegian government takes $21 per barrel of oil and gas. In the UK, we take less than $2. So it's well and good to point to the amount of tax that BP is paying when oil and gas prices are so high. But for the last 5 years, since 2016, we've actually paid more in tax rebates to both BP and Shell and other major oil and gas producers than they've paid into the Treasury. So they've been a net drain, in fact, on the UK in terms of tax revenue.
Okay.
I think the other thing...
Before I come to that point, let me put that directly to Ross. What about that? That actually, the oil companies have been a drain.
So you've noted there, Tessa, a few specific examples of companies who have received rebates on their portfolios. But overall, as an industry, we have contributed net £7 billion in the last 5 years, and as I said, it'll be £23 billion in the coming 5 years. Over the last 50 years, our industry has paid £375 billion in taxes.
Okay.
What we need to see is stability and predictability of our tax conditions to attract as much investment to the UK as possible. You make the comparison to Norway, but I think it's important to reflect that the UK and Norway are fundamentally different industries. Although we share a North Sea, we're at completely different stages of our production maturity, and also there's a completely different approach towards taxation.
Just to take you back to that, Tessa, my question though, how much would a windfall tax raise and who would benefit?
Well, it depends on how much that tax percentage is that the government increases. But there's a precedent for this. In 2011, when oil and gas prices were high and the industry was making excess profits, the then Chancellor, George Osborne, increased one of the taxes imposed on the industry, the supplementary charge, by about 10%. It's since fallen by about 20%. So there's plenty of room to increase that charge to bring it in line with what's been charged in the past. And that would bring in, again, depending on exactly how much profit's being made and where that rate is set. Groups are estimating between £2 and £5 billion, for example, which would go a long way to offset the suffering of households all across the country. But I would also just say that this isn't just a comparison that I'm making between the tax conditions in the UK and Norway. According to industry analysts Rystad, the UK offers the most profitable conditions for offshore oil and gas projects in the world. And that's because of how generous the tax regime is. And we do ask that oil and gas companies pay more tax than other industries, but that's because they're extracting a national non-renewable resource. It's not like any other business, and they should be asked to pay accordingly. And the fact is that in the UK, they just aren't.
Ross, we're hearing a lot from the oil industry that if there was a windfall tax, a lot of investment wouldn't go ahead. You made that point yourself. What kind of investments wouldn't go ahead?
So if we look at investment from the industry at the moment, we spend between around 10 and 15 billion pounds on oil and gas production and new capital investments. And as we look to the future, as companies continue to diversify their investments away from oil and gas and increasing them in renewable energies, we expect to see something in the region of 200 to 250 billion pounds of investments over the coming decade, most of which, 70-80% of which will be backed from companies who are transitioning from the oil and gas sector. These are huge amounts of money being invested by international companies.
Would they not go ahead anyway, Ross?
I think there has to be some question marks over a lot of them. These are investments which aren't yet sanctioned. They're under consideration by companies and by the regulator. And any knock to the fiscal regime can have an impact on investment. We've seen that in the past. Tessa mentioned the tax changes that have been seen back in 2011. What we've seen after that is actually companies pull a lot of investment out of the UK because of the unstable fiscal regime.
Let me put a final question to Tessa, briefly, if you will, Tessa. A lot of pensions, we hear a lot about pensions companies investing in oil and oil companies. Would pensions take a hit if there was a windfall tax?
Well, UK pension companies are a tiny slice of the main shareholders in oil and gas majors. So, in short, it would really have a marginal effect on people's pensions. But I think the more important to make about the role that oil and gas companies play in the energy transition that Ross has tried to point to is, first of all, the BP CEO today was asked whether or not a change in the tax regime would affect their plans for investment, and he was clear that the answer to that was no. And the second thing to say is that of the £20 billion in investment, according to OE UK, that's planned in the North Sea over the next 5 years, more than 70% of that would be on oil fields, the vast majority of which would be exported to international markets. So it's not going to meet energy demand in the UK, it's not going to bring down energy bills for people in the UK, and it's not in the public interest.
Very finally, just to respond to that, Ross, just very finally with a few seconds.
Yeah, but over the next decade, we see 60% of all the investments made by companies transitioning being channeled into renewable and low carbon energies, and about 40% going to oil and gas. So we see that change taking place. It is happening. And what we need to see is companies and the government stand with the industry and work with the industry to make the energy transition a reality, and one which helps affordability, supply security and sustainability all happen in tandem with each other.
Much more to be discussed, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Tessa, Ross, thank you both for joining us in Scotland tonight.